We may be spending our entire lives trying to make sense of sacred experiences like this, and I do believe they happen all the time.
You're listening to Inspire Me with Jay, where science meets spirit and stories of meditation and the near-death experience awaken what's possible within us all. I'm Jay, and this is your moment to be inspired. Welcome to Inspire Me with Jay. I'm your host, Jay Spillers. I do have a guest today, but remember to please like, share everywhere. Okay. My guest today is Michelle, and she's going to talk about her book and her sacred experience. Michelle, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good.
Okay, so I do need to explain that even though I was not actually even though I was a participant in this spiritual encounter that I'm about to describe, I was not the main recipient. And I think a lot of times when we're talking about spiritual experiences, we just assume that the person experienced everything directly. And in this case, that's not what happened. I was there as it was occurring, but I was not the main recipient of the main message. So, I did want to clarify that because I know we tried to tape this interview a couple of times before, and it just seemed like there was a disconnect. And so I wanted to preface with that explanation before we begin. With that said, my description of this event is going to be somewhat incomplete. And experiences like this, sacred encounters, apparitions, they're often sometimes very difficult to talk about just because of the sacred nature of the experience. And in this case, as I mentioned, it did not happen to me directly. And so, I was just kind of there. And I did see it happening, but I was not privy to the conversation between the visitors and my husband. So it did happen to me in a roundabout way, and it did lead, I believe, to the eventual publication of my book, which is entitled Return to Memory. The full title is Return to Memory: Recovering the Melchizedek Mysteries Beneath the Sacred Groves. And so I'm going to describe this sacred event as my husband described it to me from his particular standpoint. And the sacred experience is included as an addendum in the back of my book. My husband wrote from his perspective about this experience. So once again, I'm talking about this secondhand. Again, I was there for the encounter, but it was not my, it was not my personal revelation. So it did affect my life on many different levels. So again, I wanted to preface that before we began.
Okay. So how did this inspire you to write your book, this experience?
Well, I wanted to begin by recounting the story as my husband had described. So this story began in 2005 after I had returned from graduate school. And at the time, I had no knowledge of any of this happening. All that I knew was that I was back from graduate school. I had, I kind of, like a lot of people, when you come back from graduate school and you're not really certain about which direction your life is going, you're seeking answers. You're praying for, you're just praying for answers. And so I had actually been praying for, I was praying for direction, but I had also been spent many years just praying to find the right person, praying for my future husband. And I had given up thinking that I would ever get married. At this time, I was 26, which, to me, that seemed old, even though it really wasn't. but unbeknownst to me, my then future husband had said a brief prayer, and in his case, it was just a brief prayer to find someone. And one day when he was sitting at his apartment, three missionary types appeared to him and told him that his prayers would be answered. And at the time, he just didn't believe it. He didn't want to hear anything about that. He just thought they were coming to proselytize to him, but he just, he was like, well, I don't, I don't want to convert to any religion. So he just kind of laughed it off and thought, well, it wasn't much of anything. Well, what was interesting about that was after being told that his prayers had been answered, we would meet and start dating a week later. And then we dated for 2 years. And I wanted to get married more than anything, but there were some obstacles to overcome. And some of those obstacles, because I was much younger and just out of graduate school, and I was somewhat naive, and I'd never been married before. I didn't fully understand the obstacles that we would face. And so I do want to explain that my husband and I have a significant age difference. And so my husband had been married before, and so a lot of that factored in to his reluctance to marry me. And again, we had been dating for 2 years, but he was just very reluctant to marry me. And I felt like he was the right one, but I didn't have any certainty of that. And so and he was, again, I just kind of thought he was just like every other guy that I had dated, non-committal, and so I just kind of dismissed it as that. And I truly didn't understand his reservations at the time, given that he had went through a very complicated divorce. So it was now, fast forward 2 years to about August, I would say maybe the middle of August 2007. And we decided to take a trip to the North Carolina mountains just to go away for a couple of days. And I was not fully aware that, I kind of had some hints, or I kind of suspected it. But Robert was actually, after we took a trip to the mountains, Robert was actually planning to break off the relationship with me. So in that time, we stopped by a mountain stream that led to a waterfall. And in that moment that we had sat down, three mysterious women walked up to us, and they were all three different ages. And one of the women was closer to my husband's age. The other one was closer to my age. And so, the one that was closest to my husband's age pulled him aside and spoke with him. And that's the conversation that, as I mentioned before, I was not privy to. So I did not have a firsthand account of that particular experience. But again, I'm going off of what my husband had explained to me. And he did explain this to me a couple years later. But I do know that, based off of what he said, that in the brief time that they spoke, she convinced him that he needed to marry me. And according to my husband, this woman knew things about us that she had no business knowing. So she did say that she could see that Robert and I, that I did care deeply for Robert, and that we were good for each other. And again, she could tell that I really loved him. In spite of that, Robert, in speaking to her, he expressed his reservations. Well, there's a big age difference. I've been through a lot with, he explained, that he had been through a lot with his divorce and various other circumstances. And so but she pointed out that none of that mattered. And she did say to him, and I'll use the exact words that he gave me. she said, he, as in God, sent her to you, to my husband. And my husband was just kind of taken back by that. He didn't know what to think about it. And she seemed to know about his prior experience of the three missionary types appearing at his apartment. She knew about that. And so she told him that, not to worry, that it would be okay for him to marry me. And what was interesting about this encounter was she also I had studied in seminary, and I came back and I was just completely confused about what I really believed, and where my faith was going. And she seemed to be fully aware of that. And she reassured him that I also would find my way spiritually. And it's just very interesting that, here this woman, this mysterious woman, knew all of these things about us, but yet she had no way of, we didn't know her. She didn't know us really. And so it was just a very interesting encounter. So a year later, we would get married. My husband proposed to me about a month later, in September of 2007. And then we got married a year later in September of 2008. And so in the coming years, I would join the LDS, or the Mormon Church. And then also I would go on to pursue a PhD in comparative theology, continuing my earlier theological education that I had pursued. But in spite of that, I was left with many questions, especially after my husband had shared with me the particulars of that encounter. I was just left with a lot of questions about, what was this encounter all about? What really happened? And so this led eventually to the publication of my book. I would say indirectly, because these were not the only questions I had. And so fast forward to the pandemic of 2020, and I think we can agree that this was just a very confusing time for a lot of us. And so for me particularly, I had just finished my PhD program, and I just had a lot of questions on my mind. My PhD was in the area of temple theology, in comparative religion, comparative theology, and so anytime you finish a program like that and you defend a dissertation, you're just you're left with a lot of questions. Just kind of like I felt before when I had come back from my earlier theological studies. I was just kind of left like, okay, now what was next? I did publish an article, a peer review article, right after graduation, but that didn't answer any questions as to where I was going or how I was going to work with a lot of the information that I had been spending a couple of years writing about in my PhD dissertation. And so I think, PhD experiences leave you with a lot of questions. And so one night I was reading this book, and it's called Abraham, A Journey into the Heart of Three Faiths by Bruce Feiler. And in this book, Bruce Feiler had brought up Abraham's encounter in Genesis 18 at Mamre, where three mysterious visitors had appeared to Abraham and his wife Sarah. And I began to piece together similarities between our sacred experience, my husband and mine shared experience, and the experience at Mamre. And in this particular sacred experience, there were three visitors that appeared to Abraham and Sarah, and history is still trying to figure out who these visitors actually were. So it remains a constant question. And so as I was reading Filer's commentary on this, he made the statement that Mamre was the only piece of land that Abraham had actually purchased. So this raised questions in my mind in looking at those similarities between the sacred encounters as to what was it about Mamre that made it so mystical that three mysterious visitors would appear to Abraham and Sarah there. And how could this possibly relate, or did this even possibly relate to our spiritual experience? So I started writing, and you could say that my book, Return to Mamre, was birthed. And so the question in my mind as I was writing this was, who were these mysterious women that appeared to us, and what exactly did this mean? And then in doing further analysis of this, I began to look at how Mamre was a place of reconciliation. And this points to the reconciliation of Abraham's sons Isaac and Ishmael as they, following their father's death, this was the place where they shook hands. And so, this just kind of brought, I realized that Mamre truly was a place of deep mystery. It was a place of mystical encounters. And so the question became, what was it about this place that made it so unique and so powerful? And so, in that process, I began to realize that maybe the Mamre, being the only place that Abraham had actually purchased, maybe Mamre was the key to reconciliation among the Abrahamic faiths. And so in that case, I'm referring to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So my book delves into that as well. So, the question in my mind was, as far as our experience was concerned, was, and then Abraham's experience too was, our experience in particular, who were these angels? Or perhaps they were just regular, ordinary people. They did appear, they did appear as ordinary people. And they appeared as three Hispanic women. And so, scholars are debating today who exactly appeared to Abraham and Sarah. And even after millennia of questioning this, there are no clear answers. And so, so I felt like I was okay to grapple with those questions myself about these three women that appeared to us. Perhaps we don't have any clear answers, or perhaps Mamre holds the answers to those questions. So this left me wondering, well, what exactly, what kind of encounter was this exactly? And what did this mean for us?
So why do you think they appeared as Hispanic?
Well, while I cannot answer that question in its entirety, I do have some thoughts. And we do know, although this was, this was 2007, and as we know, since then, there's been a lot of things that have happened in our country that have not been very favorable to the Hispanic people. We've seen this, and it's a sad reality. But it is a reminder that that God does care for those who are marginalized, and Jesus himself, his ministry was devoted to those who had been been marginalized by society. And so I think that there, without sounding too political, I think that that is a message for today. Also, this may point to some other historical apparitions that have occurred throughout time. And in this case, we're referring to specifically to Marian apparitions, Guadalupe in 1531, where the Virgin Mary appeared to Juan Diego in Mexico. And also, I uncovered some interesting connections there to Fatima, which occurred in Portugal in 1917, with both of these being very powerful apparitions of the Virgin Mary, and in particular with the apparition at Fatima. Mary did present herself as the revelation image of Revelation 12 of the lady clothed with the sun, with the spinning the spinning disc, and there were a lot of people there that saw it that day. And so it did kind of remind me in some respects of those particular apparitions, especially since these women that appeared to us were of Spanish origin, or were Hispanic. And then also I thought about the Book of Mormon connections, because I am a practicing Mormon. I do go to the temple. And so I thought about those possible Book of Mormon connections to the American continent, and maybe even there's an indigenous connection there. And so those were some of my thoughts. Not that they are definitive, but those were just some of thoughts that were kind of floating around in my head as I was considering the possibilities. But interestingly, in my book, I did uncover an unlikely and there's surprising possible Mormon connection to Fatima, and you'll have to read my book to find out what that is. So now, I do think that there are some things that we can learn from these type of sacred encounters. This was not, as I mentioned before, this was not a floating, glowing apparition that we saw. Rather, it was a sacred encounter, or you could even say a visitation. These people appeared very real. And we do know that angels often appear in human form. There's nothing new to this, and that indeed is scriptural. So they didn't, and then too, they did not have any important message to convey to humanity. A lot of times with these apparitions, they will, they'll convey a powerful message like, oh, you need to pray the rosary, or you need to, there's often prophecies given that might happen in the future. None of this happened with us. And so to speak of this as an apparition is not exactly accurate. And then as I mentioned before, this did not happen to me directly. While I was sitting there talking with the other woman that was closer to my age, I was not privy again to this conversation my husband had with this other lady, and so I wasn't there to hear it. But with that said, I do think that there are valid comparisons that are to be drawn between our sacred experience and that of Abraham at Mamre, due to these very points. Number one, Abraham's encounter was not an apparition either. They appeared as real people in real time, at least from all practical appearances. And they really did not have any powerful message to convey about the future, future events or anything like that. Unless you want to consider that they did tell Abraham that Sarah would give birth to a son. You could say that was prophetic in itself, but there was, there was really no earth-shattering revelation that was given at Mamre. So these what the angels discussed with Abraham had more to do with his personal life and things that would happen to him. And then they also did mention some other things that concerned Abraham and then his nephew Lot. So, but there really wasn't a lot that they revealed in terms of future events. And then what I thought was interesting about this encounter was that just like I was there, but I was not privy to the conversation. Sarah herself in the encounter at Mamre was there, but she too was not the main recipient of the encounter. So, again, I did see a lot of parallels. That was interesting to note. And it was fun to kind of work through this in my own book. And but my book, in a lot of ways, goes beyond just looking at this apparition or this particular spiritual encounter. It delves into some other issues that I'll leave for another time. But with that said, with every sacred encounter, there's always some kind of challenge to be overcome. And I think I can definitely say that in mine and my husband's case was there have been some obstacles, and there continues to be. But we're continuing to work through some of that. Yeah, it can, a lot of times, when you're dealing with spiritual experiences like that, it can take a lifetime to unravel some of the meaning behind the mystery. And that was the main task of my book.
Well, so was there any specific lessons you learned in this encounter, the sacred encounter?
I don't know. Speaking of lessons, I don't know that there were any particular lessons that I learned. It was just more mysteries, divine mysteries to grapple with and to try to uncover. It's been an interesting journey. And certainly writing this book was a journey of not only self-discovery, but spiritual discovery, spiritual revelation. And it does solidify my belief in both personal and progressive revelation.
Well, like when you had this encounter with them, I mean, was there something that was kind of awestruck to you or mesmerizing about them in some way? Like, obviously, you're kind of like taken in and having an experience and a conversation with them. Yet they seem
Yes,
like regular people, like sometimes
they
someone can
did.
walk in a room and for whatever reason make you feel very comfortable, and you just kind of you feel free to talk to them, even though you don't even know them. There's like an
Yeah.
aura kind of about them. Was it like that?
I think there was kind of, and you mentioned was there an aura about them? I think there kind of was. I knew something extraordinary was going on, but I had not even began to uncover what that could mean. Something seemed odd about the experience. And I was not aware of the other three visitors appearing at my husband's apartment. What was it, 3 years before that, or two? I forgot the timeline there, but yeah, 2 or 3 years before. Before we in 2005, before we met. So I was not aware of that particular encounter either until my husband told me about it about a year later, after we had gotten married. So, and I remember just hearing his story and being kind of shocked. And then he told me, well, they knew about this other experience too. So they were fully aware of that. So the three by the waterfall were fully aware of that experience. And so this whole time I'm thinking, there is something odd about this. And of course, when he presented the engagement ring to me, a couple, a couple weeks later, about a month later, it was very surprising. So I knew there was something different about this.
So it's just sort of like you had to like process it. It wasn't like
Yes.
while you were there, oh, I'm talking to angels. It's like it probably took you a while to kind of think about it and be like, this couldn't have just been an ordinary experience.
It was not, and I think that's why we had tried to videotape this a couple of times before, and it just wasn't working. And I think that's the reason, is because this did not directly happen to me, although again I was there, but I'm talking about it secondhand, and so it's not as easy. And then it's just not easy to talk about sacred experiences anyway, as you know, because you wonder who might, are people going to believe me, or, and that's part of the reason that, that I sat down to write a book about this, because, again, it was my way of internalizing some of the questions I had about it, because it's not ordinary. These events are extraordinary.
Yeah, there's another event in scripture that kind of reminds me of what you're talking about. Like, remember when Paul was on the road to Damascus and he saw Christ, the risen Christ, who he was illuminated, a bright light, and was talking to him. Now, if you look at the encounters in the book of Acts, because there's 3 places in the book of Acts, it actually mentions that he had 2 companions with him. He wasn't actually by himself, but the companions only had a partial experience. I think they were able to see the light, but they couldn't hear anything. So they had definitely a spiritual experience, and it was kind of powerful, but they didn't get the full direct experience that the Apostle Paul was getting. And maybe your experience is kind of like that in a way.
Yeah, I don't know. It may have been. And that would have to be something you would have to ask my husband about, because he was the one that experienced it directly.
So is there any final words you'd like to conclude with? Any final thoughts?
Just that we may be spending our entire lives trying to make sense of sacred experiences like this, and I do believe they happen all the time. There's been numerous, as you know, you deal with near-death experiences, sacred encounters. That they're all not the same, but at the same time they are, because they're extraordinary experiences, and there's always a level of mystery and intrigue behind them. And so it may take a lifetime to try to figure out what really happened, and that's okay.
Yeah, well, and so what is the name of your book?
It's called Return to Mamre: Recovering the Melchizedek Mysteries Beneath the Sacred Groves. and it's available on both Amazon and Barnes and Noble.